Thank you guys, everybody, for joining us. Happy St. Patrick's Day. We are here with Anthony Wakowitz of Von Briesen in Roper this morning, and he is here to lead us in a discussion on effective management of the workforce, as you can see on his presentation screen. So if anybody has any questions at all, feel free to drop them in the chat. I'll kind of help him monitor that. But yeah, we'll go ahead and get started. So Anthony, whenever you're ready.
All right, well, thank you very much. And certainly feel free to call me Tony as well. And good morning, everyone, and happy St. Patrick's Day. I forgot to put on some green this morning, but I don't have a whole lot in the wardrobe. So again, as was indicated, my name is Tony Wakowitz. I'm with Von Briesen here with you this morning to talk about a variety of workforce management issues for you. Customarily, Jim Macy joins as well, but he began the morning with too much of an Irish breakfast and was unable to join us. Actually, I'm obviously kidding. Jim had a conflict that arose and had to be somewhere else. So I'm here with you this morning, and we'll take our time and go through a variety of things, and certainly answer any questions that may come up, and we'll have a discussion here, and hopefully get your St. Patrick's Day started off right. One of my favorite days of the year. I always joke when talking about it that my heritage is actually primarily Irish, given that both of my grandmothers are full-blooded Irish women, or were, and oddly enough, I ended up with a Polish last name and no Polish blood, but that's a story for another day. But nevertheless, we'll get started here and talk about a few issues, and we'll kind of start by just going through an outline today on a variety of matters that we'll kind of be talking about and discussing. And so this just gives a little bit of an outline of the issues and topics we'll discuss, and really hopefully we'll provide some information and tips and pointers on how you can effectively handle a variety of issues, whether it be through the hiring process and screening possible and potential employees, the discipline process as well, when that comes up, how to handle it, those considerations that go along with that certainly challenging process, how to handle employee improvement issues. So if there's any substandard performance and performance improvement plans that anyone would like to engage in to try to correct behavior, get on the same page with employees as far as their work performance, what the expectations are that are consistent with the culture that you and your employer wish to establish. We'll talk about a variety of those things, and then ultimately a variety of issues and considerations that come into play when dealing with separation of employment and how to handle those sorts of matters. And so that's just really a roadmap of the things that we'll be discussing today. So with that, we'll just kind of we'll get started. And really what this is about ultimately is managing and supervising your employees, and obviously focusing on their performance and conduct, and meeting your culture and organizational expectations, and really how to change any behaviors that may be necessary to keep in line with those expectations. And really, we're looking at how to help you maximize the potential of your workforce. And so with that being said, obviously a variety of considerations today and information will help you and supervisors to engage in meeting those expectations and setting forth a variety of suggested behaviors and tips and pointers in acting on these sorts of issues. So we'll kind of begin by discussing a little bit of prospective employees in the hiring process. And so what we want to make sure is that a variety of considerations are evaluated when engaging in this process. And really what we're looking at is helping to set up a standardized process in which hiring is handled consistently. So what that really ultimately does is minimize the possibility and potential of possible claims that may came up as far as discrimination, unfair treatment, things of that nature. And so really by standardizing this process and also considering the information and asking some detailed questions is helpful in the sense of making sure that you hire the right employee, because as we all know, not being able to go through some of this information, or we've all been presented with situations after the fact with hiring in which employees don't necessarily turn out as expected. There may be some just misunderstandings or just not shared views and things of that nature, which then just leads to problems and more attention that is required of you and the organization to manage their behaviors and how to deal with that. And so really what we're looking at is doing as much work and diligence as possible to obtain as much information and make that right hiring decision, and kind of head off issues before they come up, and make sure that the individuals that you select to be hired and join your organization are going to be a good fit and in line with what you're trying to achieve. And so a few things that come up with respect to part of the hiring consideration process is one, looking at the applicants and their job history. And part of that involves evaluating what their prior employment history looks like, the number of jobs that they've held, for example. Just last week, I was dealing with a disciplinary investigation issue. And as part of the interview process and in interviewing the employee as part of the investigation, just to start out with some background information, for example, went through the employee's job history. And just starting off the investigation with that process and learning the extent of their job history in a short period of time. Really, we're talking about, say, 8 different jobs in about a 5-year period, very short stays at each employer. And so this really, I think, illuminates a little bit of some considerations to take into account when determining the hiring decision. And what that does, I think, lend to is one of the other points here as far as interpersonal skills and that individual or applicant's ability to get along well with others and how they're going to fit in with your organization. So that job history, frequency, number of jobs, timing is certainly somewhat indicative of these considerations. And in addition to that, we'll also look at, say, gaps in employment. Are there periods of time in which there's substantial gaps in employment from one job to the next, and difficulties in getting a job in that time between? And so those all, again, provide additional information and context that goes to the employee and what kind of employee that they may be in, and again, factoring into their ability to get along well and work with others. And so, as indicated, what we're looking at is really standard processes, a screening process to, again, eliminate those considerations of possible claims for discrimination in the future. And what that also does is it provides a fair administration of the hiring process to all applicants. It also helps provide that in the event that any issues do come up regarding your hiring process, you can indicate that this is how things are administered on a consistent basis. And so really that's something that you can fall back on. And that also helps clearly communicate to any prospective employee, what the duties are, what the time requirements of the job, what the expectations are. And so that just helps reinforce that sort of information and helps communicate that so that everyone is on the same page as part of the hiring decision. And so as part of that standard process and screening, what you also want to ensure is that there's some training as far as the individuals who will be doing the interviewing, and standardizing your questions as part of the interview process. And again, that standardization and consistency in training, again, helps with avoiding any discriminatory content that may come up as part of the hiring process or the interview process as well. And again, it does allow to make sure that a standard review and process and screening of the application itself make sure that it's consistent with what the current law may be. Certainly, there's been a fair amount of attention recently on arrest and conviction records, for example. So certainly to make sure that your application is in line with those and ensuring that any discriminatory questions aren't being asked or considered in that regard, and that it's clear with respect to that information. And also, making sure that the standard application contains information as far as dishonesty or falsified information in the application is allowing for grounds for rejection. And also another consideration as part of that standard processing, background checks are always something as well that's handled on a consistent and constant basis. I want to make sure that you use those carefully and that you're considering any information that may come up. And again, that comes into the arrest and conviction record discrimination aspect. And so that's just another area in which to be mindful of it and make sure that those are handled in a consistent fashion and applied fairly to all applicants. And again, along with background checks, also brings up considerations with any credit reporting, credit checks that are handled and how that information is used. And ultimately what this all leads to, again, is making sure that there's an appropriate non-discriminatory reason for the hiring decision and how that's documented and applied. And then finally, with respect to hiring considerations, we want to make sure that there's also a system that maintains the documentation that supports a hiring decision, applications, interview notes, and really a standard process that maintains that documentation so that if something does come up after the fact regarding that hiring decision, those things are maintained in a spot where everyone is that should have access to that is able to obtain those in a timely fashion and use that when any questions may come up. So again, just looking at as part of the hiring process and then ultimately the hiring decision and employees that do join you, what you want to be mindful of is obviously what work environment you're looking to establish, what culture, so to speak, you have at your organization, and really communicating what the goals and expectations are, and then how the employee can meet those. And that's part of the onboarding process and something that can be communicated as well on a more consistent basis, and just to make sure that that you're doing that, and again reinforce whatever environment and culture that you wish to have. Again, as part of that process in establishing the work environment and culture that you would like, it's also important to make sure that job descriptions are updated on a pretty frequent basis, because really what you want to make sure is that you're defining what the skills are that are required for the position, what the qualifications are, and really the essential functions of the job. Time and time again, we see the importance of these descriptions and this information concerning what the skills and qualifications are, what the essential functions are. Those are things that we can always point back to and really use in making a variety of different decisions in the employment context that may come up. And so those are important to make sure that those are reviewed and updated on a consistent basis. And again, that does come into play with certain considerations under the ADA, or Americans with Disabilities Act. So those again become effective tools in using for any issues that come up with respect to those essential functions of the job. And really what they also do is they establish kind of accountability factors, objective tools for measuring the employee's performance. And so those are, again, important things that are part of the employment process in managing your employees. Another consideration that you want to be mindful of and certainly factor into and work into your work environment and culture is employee training. And what that does is that helps employees understand what their performance expectations are, allows them the ability to ask questions during any training. So really, again, communicating and making sure that everyone is on the same page with respect to what the expectations and performance requirements are. Again, it's also an important consideration on who's going to be conducting the employee training. You want to make sure that the right person is selected to be able to do that, someone who's an effective communicator, someone who's approachable, friendly, and really a good kind of teacher, kind of a role, and is able to do that. And also, is it a person that is very knowledgeable when it comes to what your culture is, what your work rules are, what your expectations are for your organization? And is it someone that sets a good example? Are they a good employee? They lead by example. And so those are all good considerations to take into account and think about when considering who you want to conduct your employee training and setting that tone and conveying the importance of the training to your employees. Another factor that goes into establishing the work environment and culture that you would like is making sure that there's a clear set of written work rules. And what that really is essential to is being able to manage your employees. It clearly communicates and conveys what your expectations are, what the rules are. And so what that does is establish notice of your for your employees. And so that if issues do come up at a later point, we can always point back to the fact that these are what the clearly established written rules are. You were apprised of what those rules are. You were on notice. You knew what they are. And if you violated them, again, it becomes a factor of you were on notice, you were aware of them, yet you clearly violated those. And so it becomes, again, important to have those written work rules that are laid out specifically in documents. They're documented, things that we can always point back to as an objective, clearly kind of black and white rule. Obviously the administration and situations may become gray, but the rules are certainly in black and white, documented in a written fashion, and that we can kind of point back to. And again, it helps everyone know what the expectations are. It helps supervisors be able to provide legitimate reasons for any discipline that may come up, and something that we can always kind of point back to. In these written work rules, they can vary from organization to organization. Some examples would be setting them out in a detailed employee handbook. Sometimes offer letters to employees may also contain some work rules, expectations for the position that they're going to be hired for, or that they have been hired for. Written work rules can also be set forth in an employment contract. I mean, there may be conditions such as confidentiality, how a person is handled or required to handle confidential information that they may become exposed to during the course of their employment, and that they have the obligations to keep that information confidential. And again, as part of the employment contract, that may come up certainly in a non-compete agreement, and that you can't take confidential information and use that to the benefit of another employer. And so work rules may be established as part of that employment contract as well. Collective bargaining agreements, again, is another place in which written work rules may be contained. There's obviously a wide variety of provisions depending upon what the collective bargaining agreement may look like. In reviewing those, I've seen a variety of them over the years. Some are very short and to the point, and others have everything but the kitchen sink in them. And so those are always kind of something to be mindful of and make sure to be reviewed and how they fit in, say with some of your other written work rules, such as employee handbooks and things of that nature. But just another spot to be mindful of and consider when establishing work rules, and also helpful if we can get some of those provisions into the collective bargaining agreements that are to our benefit. That's always a good approach as well. And so another thing to consider as part of your work environment and culture, and what helps establish that and helps supervisors be able to provide feedback and clarify expectations for employees and new hirees is a performance evaluation. This can be an extremely valuable tool when it's handled properly. And if it's not done, that can just create a host of issues. In fact, I was just talking with someone yesterday, and even they were discussing it from an employee perspective that, they haven't had a performance evaluation done in the last 5 years. And they were looking at it just in the sense of what kind of feedback, how am I doing my job, and being kind of left in a situation in which the employee doesn't know and doesn't receive any feedback. And sometimes, and a fair amount of employees really want to know that, and they want to have feedback. And it also, the absence of it can create some issues later on down the line. If there are disciplinary issues that arise, and if there isn't any documentation or performance evaluation, whether it be part of the progressive discipline process or just simply documenting performance issues, that really can create some challenges in the future. And so really in looking at performance evaluations, what you want to look at is how often you conduct them, when you conduct them. I know sometimes it becomes, or may become popular to do them at the end of the year, but then that always brings into play considerations like it's the holidays. Oh, I don't want to give anyone any sort of bad news or be negative. So those are just kind of some of the little things to take into account and consider when you do those performance evaluations and what effect that may have. Do you have a standardized process? Do you have a standardized actual evaluation? The same thing to go back to the hiring process. You want to make sure that it's just a consistent application of that process and the application itself or the evaluation itself. And really just want to make sure that is something that's carefully reviewed, meets in line with what the job descriptions contains, what the information is contained in there, what any previous goals are involved, and how those factor into the performance evaluation. Are there any prior evaluations? So you want to review any previous evaluations when you're conducting the current one. Kind of keep an eye out for any changes that have evolved or any trends, patterns that have presented themselves in reviewing past ones and where things are at currently. Certainly want to review any relevant documentation that may be involved or has arisen, say during the course of the period of time in which has gone on or evolved from the time of the last performance evaluation, if there is one, up until the current time. And as part of the performance evaluation, obviously you want to speak with any current supervisors, managers of that employee, and get their feedback, review input to incorporate as part of any performance evaluation. Certainly helpful to perform the written evaluation and complete that and conduct that prior to any meeting with the employee. So you've gone through and adequately prepared that, and you've gone through that process beforehand, so that you have that available right when you sit down to meet with the employee and go through the actual details and provide feedback concerning the report that you have prepared. And then during that part of the process, you certainly want to be mindful of soliciting and receiving any employee input as well. Sometimes people or organizations may have or request that employees fill them out themselves. And that gives a perspective on how the employee feels that they're doing. And sometimes that may become very enlightening as far as how they view what their performance is. And sometimes, you may see employees certainly either overestimate or underestimate what their performance is. And so that certainly can become enlightening as part of the process. With respect to employee performance evaluations, you also ought to be mindful that that is kept separate from any discipline process. You want to use the evaluation for the evaluation. The discipline process is something that can be handled separately, and to make sure that you keep those two topic areas separate and distinct from each other. And so when developing your performance evaluation plan too, it's also helpful to make sure that's practical, something that's not too onerous, something that just is cumbersome, and you really want to have something that's practical and really meets what you're trying to do. It includes objective standards and goals, again, to maintain that fairness and consistency. You want to have an area in which you can record your observations. You want to make sure to leave out kind of any speculation, unsubstantiated opinions, factual information, or just kind of generalities. You want to make sure that it's certainly specific and tailored to the employee and the questions that are being asked in that evaluation. It's also important to make sure that any numerical valuations, the numbering system 1 to 5, for example, that numbering is consistent in the use of your numerical ratings. So again, just to maintain that consistency and allowing employees to comment as well. And so those are all things to certainly consider in developing a practical evaluation form. Now, some common problems that do come up as part of the evaluation process that you want to make sure to be mindful of and really avoid is not having any specific comments. Again, just going back to just generalized comments, not something that's anything specific to the employee, what their behavior has been since their last evaluation, or if this is their initial evaluation. Certainly want to be specific on things that they've done, whether positive and negative, and really being individually tailored to that employee. We want to make sure that any comments that are provided are not inconsistent, and also kind of going back to the timing aspect. You want to make sure that there aren't any inflated comments or rankings. It's again back to the timing. It may become easier around the holidays to, for example, just to inflate some comments or numbers just because of the season, and as indicated, you just don't want to be viewed as too negative or providing too negative of feedback around that time of the year. And so you just want to be as direct and realistic as possible, and not inflate anything, because again, that can come back to bite us in the future if there are any problems. And certainly the employee is going to trot that out and say, well, previously you said that I did this well. You ranked me a 4 out of 5, you ranked me a 5 out of 5, and now you're creating an issue by something that has come up afterwards, and that's not consistent with the feedback that you've given previously. And so just to make sure to be as accurate and direct as possible as you can. Certainly you don't want to make any excuses. You want to be confident in any feedback and justification that you provide, and don't want to qualify it, because again, that can just come back around to be used against us. And certainly we don't want to engage in any personal, insulting, vindictive, retaliatory comments that are contained in there as well. Just keep it as clear and objective, direct, and factually specific as possible under those circumstances. So when conducting those performance evaluations, it's certainly very important to take those meetings with employees seriously. You want to make sure that you're certainly on time. They're scheduled. There's a directed time in which those are going to occur. Conveys the importance to the employee of the meeting. You want to make sure to stay on track and take the meeting seriously. You don't want to get bogged down in the details. You don't want to obviously make it personal, as we've discussed. But we want to be able to provide specific examples of things that they may have done very well during the course of the past year, or whatever time frame we're looking at, things that they could improve upon, and provide that specific feedback to the employee. We want to make sure to be honest and truthful. Sometimes truth may hurt. We want to convey that as gently as possible, but directly as possible. And so those are just some considerations to keep in mind when communicating and providing feedback to the employee as part of that performance evaluation meeting. And again, when scheduling these meetings, it's important to make sure that there's enough time. And so you can go through and give enough attention to the details and feedback that you're going to provide to the employees, and more importantly, to have enough time to allow the employee to ask questions, give them the opportunity to respond, and really have a discussion with them. We certainly want to be able to listen to the employee, hear what they have to say, let them feel like they've had the opportunity to. Sorry for that. I need to, I guess, move around a little bit more. My office has a mind of its own. But again, back to being able to provide the employee the ability to discuss and say what they want to say, and feel like they've been heard. That certainly becomes helpful if there's some negative feedback to provide. Employees don't always take that very well. It may kind of escalate the tension. Sometimes it's helpful to just let them say their piece and just listen. So I've gone through a variety of circumstances where, again, it's not engaging in a debate, getting into an argument with the employee, just being confident in what's been said, and then also just sitting back and listening, conveying the sense to them that you are hearing what they're saying, and while you may not agree with it, you certainly are listening and can convey an understanding of what they're saying. And so that may also be helpful as part of the process. And again, these meetings again present another opportunity in which to clearly communicate and express what the expectations and goals are of the employee, of the job in that position, the employee in that position, as well as the organization and the culture that you're trying to establish. And we don't want to make any sort of promises or insurance or guarantees. We want to make sure that if there is negative feedback, that the employee understands any possible consequences. If they don't continue to be able to meet the performance expectations, what consequences may be if things continue and they can't correct their behavior. So we want to make sure that they understand that we clearly communicate that. And then ultimately, depending upon what happens during the course of these meetings, some employees may choose to exercise their right to provide a written response. They certainly have that right under the law. Wisconsin statute 103.13 certainly allows employees the ability to provide a written response that has to be basically incorporated as part of their personnel file. And so they do have the right to do that. And some employees may choose to do that. And so something to just be aware of. And then after the meeting, it's important to be mindful of or consider that if there is going to be any follow-up and when that may be required, again, to communicate or just follow through on setting any new goals or communicating those new goals throughout the course of the next evaluation period. If there is any need for probation, what those conditions may be. Again, following up and communicating that with the employee, taking advantage of any opportunity to offer any additional training, coaching, other assistance that the employee may be. So follow up and just kind of checking in to make sure that they're aware that that's available and that they can choose to take advantage of that if they so wish. And then really, if there's a need for any sort of other accommodations, things of that nature for the employee, and then making sure to follow through with all those points of consideration and any promises to have follow-up meetings or provide any interim evaluations. So again, maybe to do that on a more consistent, frequent basis before what would normally be your usual evaluation period. Maybe it makes sense under the circumstances to do that on a more frequent basis, whether it be monthly, quarterly, to again provide more instant, immediate feedback, allows them to be able to try to correct that behavior in the meantime instead of just going, say, another whole year before again we may be right back where we started. And so those are just important follow-up considerations to think about. So moving on, as part of that performance evaluation process, certainly that implicates some considerations as far as discipline, and that may come up as illustrated through the evaluation process. But as we talked about earlier, we want to make sure to keep these processes separate and distinct. But the evaluation process may enlighten us. It may kind of expose us. It provides something visual in a sense too, that we can see it in front of us. There does seem to be a pattern with this. It's something that keeps repeating itself. How do we correct this behavior? Is the evaluation process being effective in that regard? And if not, what do we need to do next? And so those are kind of the implications that then raise this issue of discipline. And even separate from the evaluation process, the matter just may present itself just because of the employee's behavior. And so what we really want to consider and think about is when does discipline become appropriate? And so we'll kind of look through a variety of bullet points here as far as generally when this issue may come up. Back to those written work rules that we discussed earlier, employees may just have simply violated them. And so that issue may come to our attention. And if there's a violation of the rules, certainly we want to make sure to address that. And really give meaning to those rules and make sure that they don't just exist on paper, and really establishing that accountability standard for your organization, that these rules exist for a reason. We need to make sure that they're enforced. We need to make sure that they're enforced on a consistent basis, that they're fairly applied to all employees. They don't just apply to some and not to others. And so really this is when discipline kind of comes up, and giving meaning to those rules and holding our employees accountable for any violations. Discipline also can kind of come up just with generalized unprofessional behavior, poor performance, rude, disrespectful conduct. At a recent case, again last week, in which the employee, for about the fifth time, just continued to engage in that unprofessional conduct. Had been previously documented, and it got to the point where, all right, there has been prior discipline. We need to move to the next step, and just a part of that progressive discipline process, and making sure that discipline is appropriate, and that this conduct and unprofessional, rude, disrespectful behavior is not to be tolerated. That's just something culturally we're not acceptable with, and we're just not going to tolerate. Again, discipline may come up with insubordination, back to those work rules, being ordered by supervisors, department heads, your leaders, so to speak, in your organization, giving directives, commands, orders, and then employees just simply not following those or disregarding those, and not following that chain of command, not following what the directives are. And so with not following what's been asked and required of them is certainly cause for discipline. Then, of course, being dishonest, lying, deceitful behavior, dishonesty, again, just another sort of behavior that is not tolerable. The law is very clear that this sort of behavior is not tolerated, and really can result in some grave consequences in a pretty immediate fashion. And so again, establishing that culture, that sort of deceitful, dishonest behavior is not tolerated. And then certainly engaging in any sort of violence, physical violence, certainly not tolerated, contrary, and may rise to the level of criminal behavior. So even verbal behavior may rise to that level, but again, that can factor back into whether it's kind of verbal violence, certainly rude, unprofessional conduct at a minimum, and again, engaging in vulgar, obscene, verbal behavior. It can certainly be construed as verbal violence in addition to physical violence. So these are all the sort of circumstances and typical scenarios which create general causes that result in the disciplinary process. Again, look, even just thinking about work rules, violations, a drug and alcohol policy, just another kind of written work rule to keep in mind that certainly may result in discipline if any violations of that. That certainly can be very severe and require immediate attention. Dishonesty, again, factors back into theft, that sort of dishonest conduct, and again, just more causes for general discipline. And so as part of the disciplinary process, when those sorts of considerations come up for you, there needs to be an investigation. And so just in taking an overarching view as far as conducting those investigations, because we obviously want to make sure that we do a fair, objective, thorough investigation to support any ultimate discipline that we want to take, and we're aware of the possible violations that may result in discipline. We want to keep these considerations in mind and looking at a general overview when it comes to investigations. And we want to make sure that any investigations that we perform are certainly effective. And effective can mean a variety of different things, because we want to make sure that they reduce liability and risk to the organization, that the investigation is really conducted in an effective and fair manner. So we do reduce liability, risk, legal costs as part of that investigatory process. And again, it conveys the organizational and public confidence in the process. and it ultimately results in a more professional workforce. It also makes sure that employee rights are protected, so we don't have something that comes up where we may have violated an employee's rights during the portion of the investigation process. And then as a result, we can't take any sort of ultimate action that we want, or it looks like that there may be an improper motive. The investigation was tainted from the beginning, which then factors back into what we just discussed as far as possible liability and risks and legal costs, and as well as the confidence in the process. So by doing that and making sure that we're mindful of employee rights, it conveys the importance and the value that we place on what their rights are. And really, ultimately, at the end of the day, we're confident enough that we can conduct an investigation and comply with those rights. And we're going to be able to obtain the information that we need to. We're going to be able to conduct our investigation in a way that is respectful of that. The rights aren't a hindrance to what we're trying to do. It really is about we have a thorough, comprehensive investigation process that incorporates those rights, and really it's just part of the process. And again, it conveys confidence in our ability to do the investigation, management's ability to handle the investigation, and ultimately what management's decision is as part of the investigation. And again, going back to that overarching concern that we always have, we want to make sure that our decisions are able to be justified as legitimate. They're not discriminatory. Things are applied in a fair and consistent manner. And so we just ultimately want to make sure that we're mindful and considerate of that. And we're fairly treating all employees in the same way. And so that similarly situated employees are all treated in the same manner and appreciated in the same manner. And so ultimately, what the real goal that we have as part of any investigation is to make sure that we uncover and gather information to the highest degree of accuracy possible. We want to make sure that we understand what the objective facts are. We want to establish and conduct a lawful, fair, and credible process. And again, that goes back to making sure that the reasons and rationale ultimately for any decision is legitimate and non-discriminatory. We also want to make sure that our goal is to reduce and eliminate any uncertainty, prevent surprise during the course of the investigation, address any challenges to any evidence that may come up. We want to make sure that we confront that, we face it, we address what the challenges may be, and that again, it goes back to ensuring that it's a fair, credible process. It's something that we're confident in. And it's something that we're honest about. Not every situation is perfect. We certainly have our challenges, but we're not afraid of it. We know how to handle it. It's part of something that is a consideration that we keep in mind during the process. It's part of something that we keep in mind when we're making a decision. It may be something that's a mitigating factor ultimately in what we decide. But it's something that we have to be aware of. We have to be conscious of. We don't want to just engage in kind of a perspective of denial just because something's challenging or it may create some resistance or friction. We want to make sure to face it. And again, that goes back to making sure that the process is fair. And it makes the decision meaningful. It makes the decision accurate. And really, these are ultimately what our goals are, and conveys that credibility, that confidence that we're able to handle and manage these sorts of situations. And it conveys that importance to all of our employees and to our workforce, and really reinforces the culture that we're looking to establish. So ultimately, these are a variety of action steps that you want to make sure that you do when you engage in the investigation process. And the first thing to ensure is that you make sure that the investigation is promptly conducted. Obviously, things are very busy, and there are a variety of things going on at any one time. And certainly it's reasonable that this is not the only thing that you may be needing to do. But at the same point, it does have to rise to the top on your to-do list, so to speak, and you want to make sure that the things are promptly addressed. And certainly it may just become the fact, just because of the severity of the circumstance or the situation. Obviously, the very severe situations are going to just require immediate attention. And sometimes that may be the sole focus of your attention because of that. But in other sorts of situations, it's just important to make sure that it's addressed in a timely fashion, certainly for your sake, the organization's sake, the employee's sake. And what we don't want is what I call sometimes that psychic drag, where it's on everyone's minds, and then it can just be very distracting. It can just create a period of unproductivity. And so we just want to make sure that we get to it and address it in a prompt and fashion and reasonable fashion under the circumstances. And again, that factors back into the importance of the situation. The disciplinary process is important. It's something that requires prompt attention. It's important to us, and so we need to do it in a prompt fashion. As part of the investigation process, certainly when beginning, we want to make sure that we sit down and review what the allegations are. How specific are they? How general are they? We want to make sure that we're aware of the breadth and depth of the allegations. We want to try to gain some insight as far as where things may lead, and are there any other ancillary allegations that may come up as part of this. We want to know who the witnesses may be. We want to know who has direct firsthand knowledge, who has observed any sort of disciplinary, observed any behavior that may result in disciplinary action, may have read or seen, and really who has direct firsthand knowledge. And so we want to make sure that we figure out who those individuals are, and we want to review any relevant documentation, whether it's policies, procedures, those written rules that we kind of talked about, prior performance evaluations that we talked about. Are there relevant logs that come into play as far as documentation, emails, all those sorts of considerations, or other any sort of extraneous documentation. Sometimes there may be electronic records that come into play, phone records. Again, those are all things to kind of keep in mind and be mindful of in developing an investigation plan. It's also important ultimately to inform the employee of the investigation, provide them notice so that they can be prepared for. And again, going back to that fair, objective, kind of due process type of a situation where we're mindful of the employee's rights and to be aware of what they're being investigated for, and be able to give their side of the story. I mean, they have to be aware of what they're being investigated for so that they can know what they actually have to respond to. Now, we don't have to certainly provide a great level of detail because we want to be mindful of our investigation and make sure that we keep certain things close to the vest so that the employee doesn't have the opportunity to develop their response beforehand and create a story before the opportunity to question them regarding that. But we want to make sure that we're mindful of that they have fair notice, that we schedule a meeting so that they know that it's coming up, that they aren't just blindsided by a meeting where we sit down and just get right into this. and conveying and communicating to the employee that we're going to have this meeting, you're going to have the opportunity to give your side of the story. And again, this all goes back to making sure that the investigation is engaged in a positive, direct and fair manner. And again, it really conveys that objectivity concerning the investigation process. Because what we want to do is make sure that we stick to the facts of the situation. We want to give the employee objective information as part of that investigation process and meeting with the employee, so that they can provide that response. And setting that tone hopefully will result in the same kind of response from the employee, that they give us the factual information. And then if they do head off into other tangents, whether it be personal attacks or non-relevant information, or just that sort of response, that certainly is indicative of kind of where their mindset is at. And it may convey a little bit of that victim mentality. It may convey that they're being non-responsive to what the allegations are. They're not denying it. They're talking about something else. And again, that certainly can demonstrate to us really what the credibility of their response is and the credibility of the information and allegations that we have. So as part of that, that comes into play as far as just considering what the employee's reaction is, being mindful of what their physical reactions are, and what their verbal reactions are. So what we want to do is part of that meeting, we want to make sure that we, again, allow the employee to ask questions, provide feedback, provided that's relevant. We don't need them to start talking about another situation that pertains to someone else, and what does that have to do with this is really what it comes down to. We want to make sure that this stays on track. We're clear, we're direct, because we don't want to taint the investigation by getting into some other sort of irrelevant situation. We want to make sure that this is a formal process. We're clear, we're specific, we stay on track, we stay on task, and we keep it relevant to the information and allegations that we've learned of. Because if we start going off on a fishing expedition, then that just can undermine ultimately what we want to do, if anything, as part of the discipline process. And then it just looks like we're looking around for other motives to justify any sort of action that we may want to take in the future. And so really it comes back to maintaining that formality, that objectivity as part of the process, and staying on task. So as part of that disciplinary investigation, another important action that we want to do once we get through the investigation process is that we want to make sure that we sit down, we evaluate all the relevant information. We really kind of take a step back. We consider all the facts before making a decision. We certainly just don't want to jump to conclusions. We want to make sure that we consider all the relevant information and how it may be viewed, and really giving meaning to what the employees had to say, what their feedback is, and then also considering independent information, looking at that documentation, which again is more objective in nature. We want to detach and consider what witnesses had to say, what their relationship may be as part of the process, and really stepping back and considering all that information before we make a decision. Again, we just don't want to jump to conclusions. And then ultimately, we want to make sure that any confidentiality obligations are protected to the extent that we can. Sometimes in the public sector, certainly we have some different rules that may apply, and our confidentiality may sometimes be limited depending upon the facts and circumstances. But otherwise, we want to protect it as much as possible, and be mindful of that. So some things that we want to make sure that we do not engage in during the course of the investigation is that we don't want to sympathize with the employee. We don't want to become their advocate or their ally, so to speak. We want to make sure that we are a neutral investigator, so to speak. A little bit of the just the facts, ma'am, back to the dragnet analogy. Making sure that we're staying detached, that we're staying neutral. We're not biased one way or the other. And so we don't want to sympathize with the employee, because then that just can, whether it be embolden them, or it just conveys maybe a sense to them that, well, I am justified in my behavior. And then later on down the line, if we do want to take some sort of action, they may feel like they've gotten mixed messages, and that there is this inconsistency, because there is this how do we want to say it? There's this perception, basically, during the investigation that, well, I was kind of justified in my behavior, or I was receiving some sympathy or empathy as far as why I did what I did, and so that just can come back to bite us. Again, going back to rude, disrespectful type of behavior, we don't want to interrupt or talk over the employee. Really convey a message that what they have to say is not important, or that it kind of escalates the tension. So we want to just be patient. We want to make sure that we listen, and we just don't want to keep interrupting them and talking over them. We don't want to get defensive. Certainly, I'm sure we've all been in situations where employees then start to lodge accusations against whether it be us or the organization, and we don't want to get defensive about that. We don't want to engage with them in the same level of tone and approach. We just want to, again, going back to staying objective, detaching, neutral, not escalating the tension. We don't have anything to hide, where there's nothing that we need to get defensive regarding. So we're just going to listen to what you have to say. We don't want to engage in any sort of bargaining, and not only in the sense of collective bargaining, but bargaining with the employee, like, well, if you do this, then we'll do that. Again, this is an investigation. What we're really looking at is just obtaining the factual information, hearing your side of the story, obtaining any documents, really gathering as much evidence as possible, so that we can use that to make our decision. This is not the time for any sort of bargaining or negotiating with the employee regarding anything. And so we don't want to get into discussing any political motives. We don't want to get into discussing this person and how they do this, and any interpersonal conflicts, or I did this because this other person did this, or in this other situation, this person did this and nothing happened to them, which they may or may not know of anyways. We don't want to get into all those sorts of side issues. Yeah, I was speeding, but so was the other person. I mean, that just doesn't go a long way when you get pulled over for an example. And so we don't want to get into those side issues or motives that people have, because that just undermines the credibility of the objectivity of our investigation. So with that in mind, once we've concluded the investigatory process, now we move on to evaluating the information. And once we've evaluated the information and we've just determined that there should be some discipline, then it becomes a question of, well, what discipline is appropriate under the circumstances? And this is a challenging question, because not every situation is the same. We've got our rules, and we may have different behavior that violates the same rules. We may have similar behavior that violates different rules. I mean, it's a situation that's certainly in flux. I mean, the more that I do this, I mean, we still continuously day to day see circumstances that we could never envision, and it keeps things interesting. It keeps things challenging. It keeps things fresh. And so really that goes back to it as far as making that decision on what's appropriate discipline. And so these are just a variety of considerations that you can evaluate when making that decision of what level of discipline is appropriate. Certainly we consider the severity of the behavior. Is there any prior discipline? Does this employee have a disciplinary record? Have we gone through the progressive disciplinary steps and process? Is that even warranted? Is progressive discipline going back to the severity of the behavior, which at this point has not been substantiated or corroborated? We also want to consider any mitigating or aggravating factors. As we kind of discussed earlier, we want to be mindful of it and confront any challenging issues. And sometimes that may be a mitigating factor. But at the same point, we also we consider the flip side of that coin in aggravating factors. Did the employee double down on their behavior, so to speak? I mean, did they violate a work rule, and then did they lie about it? Those are things, again, that aggravate the underlying circumstances. We want to consider that. Length of service. I mean, certainly, is it a probationary employee? Is it a 30-year employee? If we've got a 30-year employee with no disciplinary record whatsoever, that's certainly a consideration that we want to take into account. Are there circumstances that created obstacles on their performance? I mean, certainly the last couple of years, we've all had a variety of challenging obstacles to how we do things. And has that created some sort of legitimate performance obstacle? And so those are things that we want to be mindful of. Are there things that are somewhat out of the employee's control? So that's just another consideration when looking at what may be the appropriate level of discipline. Again, back to the fairness and consistency. What discipline have we applied and implemented in similar sorts of cases? We want to make sure that we're consistent. And again, that helps us show that there isn't any discriminatory motive. It conveys a fair application of the rules to all employees. So we want to make sure that we do that. Are the employees on notice of what those work rules are? That factors into what level of discipline they should get. And have they have the opportunity to correct their behavior? So again, those are all a variety of different considerations to think about and evaluate when determining what level of discipline is appropriate under the circumstances. So we'll just kind of touch upon what the various levels of discipline may be. It can be a verbal warning, verbal reprimand, kind of starting at that baseline. And providing that kind of immediate feedback. This is kind of what supervisors are for too, right? To monitor employees' behavior on a day-to-day basis and give that more immediate feedback. And if they do something that comes to the supervisor's attention, that whether it's violate work rules, it's just kind of like, well, your standard of behavior could be a little bit better. That conduct is a little bit, could be construed as unprofessional. I'd recommend you handle it in this way. So giving that more immediate feedback. So that verbal warning or reprimand is kind of a good start to the discipline process and starts out the progressive discipline. Thereafter, again, if we're seeing the same sort of repeated behavior, then it can rise to the level of a written warning, written reprimand, in which we're starting to document the discipline. And so we're going to go through and we're going to do that. And again, moving on as part of that progressive disciplinary process, then we would move on to a suspension. Is demotion warranted? Does the employee need to be put on probation? given that kind of last chance type of an agreement, or ultimately do we move to termination? So these are the various levels of progressive discipline that we can engage in. And when we do engage in implementing any sort of discipline, we want to make sure when we communicate that we, again, are positive, direct, and fair. We want to explain the basis for the discipline. We want to provide reason or reasons for that, but we don't want to get into too much detail. Sometimes less is more, because that can just create more of an argument with the employee. And again, we should be able to be concise and direct enough and get to the point as far as the ultimate reason and rationale for the decision. We want to emphasize that it's final. We considered all relevant information and factors. We considered all the evidence. We considered what the employee had to say. And so you've had your opportunity to do that. We've considered all of that. And as a result, we've decided to implement this level of discipline, and that decision is final. Obviously, they have their ability to challenge that under the relevant policies or procedures, if that's available to them, whether it's in the employee handbook or CBA, but that's separate, at least for this stage of the process. We wanted to emphasize that it's final. And then we want to follow up by documenting that the reason rationale for the discipline. We want to do that in a letter, so we have that documentation, and then we want to have the employee acknowledge the receipt of that. And really, this is to, again, just demonstrate and document the progressive discipline. Again, we want to make sure that we document this so that if we do need to address something in the future, we can point back to this. We're not saying, well, we're not incorporating it later on something that had happened previously, because then it just illustrates that we may have some sort of improper motive, and now we're trying to generate this after the fact. And so it just opens the door to that argument. And ultimately, when documenting discipline, we want to make sure that we give employees copies of notices and any warnings, and make sure that they sign an acknowledgement of this, and that we retain those documents. So again, it's something that we can kind of point back to, that they're on notice of, and just helps as part of that disciplinary process. And then if they refuse to do that, then we document that as well. And then ultimately, what we want to focus on is just having them acknowledge that they are receiving this. It's not that they agree with it, it's just acknowledging that they receive it. And again, as we kind of touched upon briefly earlier, the employee does have rights to, under the circumstances, to provide a written response under the law. And that would just be an additional document that would be included as part of the discipline. And then make sure when we do document the discipline, we include this relevant information. Some of the background information that's relevant, the dates, factual details. We don't want to engage in any speculation. We want to keep it as objective and factually specific as possible. We want to include witnesses, any statements, the relevant rules, policies that are implicated. We want to make sure to incorporate any prior discipline or employee infractions or violations. We want to be mindful of and incorporate the employee's side of the story, their explanation, to again demonstrate that we have considered that. And then ultimately, we want to be clear on what the conclusion is and our clear statement of action that is to be taken, and then what future consequences that may be possible. Such as up to and including termination. That's kind of the standard terminology and language that we like to use. Again, so the employees are on notice on that consideration. Now, sometimes circumstances arise where an individual may have just exercised or in the process of exercising rights under the Family Medical Leave Act. There may be some ADA implications that come into play when we're looking to implement discipline. This is a very touchy area. It's very challenging. It's very difficult. So we want to make sure that we tread very carefully when these sorts of situations. Now, the law does say that we're not prohibited from taking disciplinary action just because there may be ADA implications or maybe FMLA implications. But we just want to be very mindful of this. And really, a lot of problems that we see time and time again really comes into play with the timing of discipline relative to the exercise of any FMLA rights or any ADA implications. What we don't want to do is terminate someone right after they've exercised FMLA rights. That just, it looks bad, even though technically we may be able to do something under the circumstances, it just looks bad. And so timing is always an important consideration with discipline when these sorts of rights are implicated. And we also want to make sure that we consider both federal and state provisions. And so this is really kind of a very detailed, fragile topic that requires a lot of nuanced discussion that we can save for another time. But just something to keep in mind, that you always want to just look at the timing of these sorts of situations when you do want to implement discipline. Again, there is the Social Media Act with the state of Wisconsin. Employees are allowed to make some requests of employees when it comes to the use of their social media. Again, that's another kind of detailed discussion. But we also want to keep in mind that employees do have the right to protect concerted activities, such as for union organization. So they are allowed to use that. And there also are First Amendment implications that come into play. Now, there does get to be a question as far as whether any speech that they engage in is something that, whether they're on duty or it's during the course of their employment, and is it related to their employment or their job duties. But again, this is just another consideration to keep in mind in evaluating a more specific basis if these sorts of situations come up as part of the disciplinary process. So we'll kind of talk about a performance improvement plan. Sometimes circumstances may arise as part of the disciplinary process in which individuals don't necessarily need to be terminated. We've gone through a little bit of the progressive discipline process. We want to at least allow the employees the opportunity to try to improve their performance and give them, whether it be a last chance or the opportunity to correct their behavior. And so if we do that, we want to really engage in a performance improvement plan and document that and what that plan looks like. And so what we want to do is when we engage in this sort of a process and putting this plan together, that we've documented their performance issues. Again, it goes back to documentation, so it's something that we can kind of point back to. It doesn't look like we're fabricating something after the fact. It looks like we've been mindful of this. We've addressed it on a consistent basis. We don't have any discriminatory motives. And so we want to make sure that we've documented these sorts of things and address these performance issues on a timely basis. And again, going back to that performance evaluation, documenting these things when they arise also helps conduct those evaluations when it comes time to do those. And then we've also kept this separate in documenting their performance issues when they've come up on a timely basis. As part of that documentation, we want to make sure we include that factual detail on what the relevant dates are, when this happened. We want to talk about the actual performance that the employee engaged in. We want to be as specific as possible. We want to talk about any discrepancies and what their performance is and should be. So we want to talk about a detailed description of what their expected performance is, what their expectations are, and we just want to document what the expectations are, what their actual performance was, and making sure that those things are linked in really covering how they, while they're linked, how they aren't connected, because there's a difference between what they're actually doing and what their expectations are. And then again, documenting any disciplinary action that may have occurred. So we want to incorporate that as part of any performance improvement plan. And then also when drafting any performance improvement plan, we want to make sure that we address what the specific and detailed objectives are to correct the deficiencies. We want to design it in such a fashion that it's relevant to what the deficient expectation or the deficient performance is. And again, linking those things up and making sure that what the expectations are clear, they're specific, and the improvement that we're asking for is meant to address their actual behavior, and it's designed that we expect you to act in this specific way, and this is how we're going to design that. So we have specific measurable objectives, something that's concrete, and not something that's just generalized. And so we want to make sure to be as specific as possible, and that it's individually tailored to the individual and to the job that they're in, and what to those essential duties, qualifications, skills, functions are of that job, and really linking all those things together. Then as part of the performance improvement plan, we also want to make sure that we've identified a specific individual that's going to oversee the implementation of that plan, can do that follow-up, can make sure that the individual is attempting and trying to correct those deficiencies. They're engaging in actual behavior as designed in the performance improvement plan to meet those specific objectives, and really overseeing that, being able to provide feedback, also to be an ear to the employee. If the employee has questions, how am I doing? Is what I'm doing meeting what's laid out in the performance improvement plan or the PIP? And so really we have that contact point and that individual who can do that on a more frequent and specific basis. And then as part of any PIP, we want to make sure that we provide a specific time frame. It's not just an open-ended document that's just going to exist in perpetuity. We want to make sure that there is an expectation on timeframes on corrective behavior, and whether we do that on a step-by-step basis, on a frequent basis, or more expanded timeframes depending upon what the plan may include. That's certainly on an individualized basis. And so with that, sometimes things just don't work out, whether the performance improvement plan just doesn't work, or the severity of the situation of the investigation just rises to the level of termination. And so we've come to the point where we've made that decision. We've gone through a fair objective process. We've detached and considered the information, all the relevant information, including the employee's perspective and view. But we've decided that we want to move to termination. Ultimately, what we really want to consider is a resignation and a release agreement in lieu of having to make that termination decision. And really what that is it provides a degree of protection for the employer. And it also can be something that is protective of future costs, whether it be literal costs of just having to defend any sort of termination aspect and all the resulting consequences that may come as part of those proceedings, or even just figuratively, the cost sometimes, again, just back to that drag on the psyche and the organization. Is this something that's the termination process is just going to drag out for a long period of time? And do we have other more important things to do? And is this a way we can protect the organization? We can get things done in a timely fashion. We get a benefit out of it to have this done now. We obtain a release of all claims, so we don't have this possibility of litigation hanging over our head, and then what the cost of that may be. I've just seen that time and time again, the drain that can have on an organization just with the employees. And so there's really a benefit to considering these sorts of agreements. And so really, as part of those agreements, we want to make sure that there is a clear statement of resignation by the employee, that we as the employer are accepting that resignation. We're providing consideration, and that gets to be a legal term of art at times, which is really what the financial value is and what each party is getting out of it. Is there severance pay? Is there accrued vacation or other payouts that the employee is entitled to? Do we want to offer to continue to pay health insurance for a period of time or not contest unemployment? Do we want to provide a letter of reference, even if it's a neutral one? Again, the main thing we want to focus on is the release of claims by the employee. We want to make sure that there is no possibility of future litigation, because that's just a large benefit from the employer's perspective. We want to make sure that the employee forfeits any right to any future employment, so we don't get in a position of any reinstatement, things of that nature. Again, the confidentiality piece, keeping this confidential and being respectful of confidential personnel matters to the extent that we can, and then that there is no admission of liability or wrongdoing. So again, when implementing any termination decisions, some things to think about just before we implement that decision. We want to consider whether that individual needs to be released immediately. What's the timeliness that we want to engage in when implementing this decision? What day? Do we want it on at the end of the week? Is this something that we need to do right now? What's going to happen with the employee and their equipment that they have that's been issued from the employer? Keys, computers, badges, all those sorts of things. Their access to email, phone, all those sorts of things. Those are things to make sure that are arranged and considered. Whether they have the chance to gather all their things, whether they have a locker or office and workspace and personal effects, how that's going to be gathered. And then again, back to that reference letter, any payouts, things of that nature. Is there an employment contract? Is there a non-compete clause that we have to consider? And then as part of implementing it, do we have to go through the just cause process, the 7 steps, or is this just an at-will probationary employee? So those are all implementation considerations. And handling the actual termination itself, we don't want to rush this. We don't want to, again, engage in that kind of escalating behavior that's defensive, where there's any haste or anger. We want to be prepared. We want to check with HR, legal counsel before the termination actually occurs to make sure that there isn't anything else that we need to be mindful of and prepare for. We want to complete all the documentation prior to that termination meeting so that that's prepared and we're ready, and that helps us provide that reason and rationale. We've considered the just cause and due process implications for the employee. We've planned the meeting out. We've identified any security issues and alerted anyone that may need to know that there may be some sort of a situation that may arise. And again, we're prepared for the reasons for termination. We want to make sure that employer representatives are there. We don't want to just do this with one person in the room. Ideally, we'd like to have at least up to 2 other representatives, but make sure that there's at least 2 that are present. Again, alert security if appropriate. Sometimes it's helpful to prepare an outline or a script that helps you just go through that process, and something that you can refer to, because these are obviously sort of challenging situations. We want to tell the employee the reasons for the decision as honestly as possible and gently as we possibly can, but directly and honestly as we possibly can. And then again, allow them the opportunity to comment on that. We don't want to argue and negotiate at that point. Our decision's final again. We've ultimately, if there is going to be a release, we've engaged in that process separately, or we can do that at another point. And we're also to shift and discuss any severance and benefits if we need to, and handle that separately. And again, making those sorts of arrangements for the return of property and the employee's orderly departure from the premises. And then ultimately, we want to make sure that we document that meeting immediately thereafter, and that includes all the participants and representatives that were present for the meeting. After the termination, we want to make sure that we have a standardized process or procedure for handling any reference requests that may come in, how to document and incorporate any information that comes up after the fact. Certainly sometimes other employees may come out of the woodwork, so to speak, and give us a lot of information about that particular employee after the fact, and just documenting that and incorporating that, how we're going to handle unemployment inquiries in that process, and then any requests from the employee to view their personnel file or get copies of that, as they are allowed to do by law. And so we just want to make sure that we have a standardized process. So again, a lot of information here today. Hopefully that helped you gain a lot of information and perspective on how to effectively manage your workforce and handle the challenges that come through in the hiring process, the investigation process, the discipline process, and then ultimately performance improvement and termination if need be, and then what happens after. So really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today. I hope you have a great St. Patrick's Day. Everyone can now go enjoy that, as well as March Madness. And I am looking forward to a Guinness later tonight. Hope everyone has a great day. Again, thanks. I really appreciate your attention, and appreciate the chamber putting this on.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tony. Thanks for joining us today. Everybody have a good day.
All right, thank you.